In the spring of 1987, the chainsaws came to Hardin County, Missouri. Not all at once. The way things happen in farm country, it started quietly. One man on one fence line, on one Tuesday morning in March, with a Husqvarna and a half-tank of bar oil, and an idea he'd been carrying since the November co-op meeting. By April, the sound had spread to 3 neighboring operations. By June, you could smell the burn piles from the highway. By the end of that summer, Hardin County had lost more than 800 acres of tree lines, hedgerows, and windbreaks that had stood, in some places, since before anyone living could remember. And at the center of all of it, at the center of every argument, every co-op conversation, every extension office bulletin, was a number: 3 acres. Not 300, not 3,000. 3. That was how much cropland a farmer could recover, on average, by clearing the tree lines that ran between his fields. A row of Osage orange and elm and cottonwood, planted by a grandfather or grown up on their own along a fence row, took anywhere from 15 to 40 feet of ground on each side when you accounted for root competition and canopy shade. Clear the trees, pull the stumps, and you had 3 acres back. 3 acres, at corn prices in 1987, was worth about $1,800 a year, and $1,800 a year, to a man with a mortgage and a note on a planter and 2 boys in school, was not nothing. The man who started the clearing was named Dale Fricka. Dale farmed 480 acres in the central part of the county, and he was not a reckless man. He'd thought about it. He'd asked the county extension agent, a sharp-eyed young woman named Brenda Holt, fresh from the University of Missouri with a degree in agronomy and a stack of USDA production efficiency reports. Brenda had shown Dale the numbers: 3 acres recovered per mile of tree line cleared, at $600 per acre gross margin on corn. That was $1,800 per mile. Dale had 4 miles of tree lines on his property, $7,200 a year. Dale didn't sleep well for 3 nights. Then he picked up the phone and called a guy with a chainsaw. By May of '87, Dale's fields were open from fence line to fence line. The old hedgerows were ash and stumps. The cottonwoods that had lined his north boundary since 1932 were firewood, stacked behind the machine shed. The Osage orange that had grown along his east fence, trees so hard and dense that the old-timers had called them ironwood, were burned in a pile that smoldered for a week. Dale planted corn on every acre he'd recovered. He was pleased. His fields looked efficient, clean, modern. A man flying over Hardin County that summer would have looked down at Dale's farm and seen exactly what the agricultural economics of 1987 said a farm should look like: unbroken, productive, cleared of anything that didn't grow bushels. He would have also seen, 3 miles to the north, a farm that looked different, a farm with trees still standing. Now let me tell you about Earl Boden, because you need to understand the man before you can understand the decision, and the decision before you can understand what happened 14 years later. Earl was 58 years old in the spring of '87. He'd farmed the same 360 acres in the north part of the county since 1971, when his father, Roy Boden, had signed the place over to him on a Thursday afternoon at the Farmers State Bank in Waverly and gone to live with Earl's sister in Kansas City. Roy had built the tree lines. Not all of them. Some had grown up naturally along fence rows, elm and cottonwood seeding themselves in from the creek bottoms. But Roy had deliberately planted the windbreak along the north boundary in 1954, a double row of eastern red cedar and green ash running 3/4 of a mile, breaking the northwest wind before it hit the fields. Roy had planted it because 1953 had been a dry year, and the wind that came off the open ground north of the property had taken a visible toll: pale streaks in the topsoil, the dark organic layer thinning where the northwest corner of the field lay exposed. Roy had planted the trees the way a man builds a storm door, not because he was sentimental about trees, because the wind was costing him something he couldn't afford to lose. Earl had grown up watching the trees work. He'd seen what happened in a dry spring when the wind came. the brown haze over the open fields to the south, the pale drift of topsoil collecting in the fence rows, and he'd seen what the windbreak did to that same wind on his father's north fields. The cedar absorbed the blow. The air that came through the canopy and around the edges was slower, gentler, less capable of picking up the Grundy silt loam that sat on the gentle slope of Earl's North 40. Let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching this video from. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and stay with us, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next video. So when Dale Fricke started clearing in March of '87, and the co-op talk turned to tree lines and recovered acres, Earl Boden sat at the counter and drank his coffee and didn't say much. He let the others do the talking. The talking was enthusiastic. 3 acres a mile, said Kenny Watts, who farmed south of town and had already gotten quotes from a guy with a skid loader. I got 6 miles of hedgerows. That's 18 acres I'm not farming. And the root competition, said Pete Halloran. Those hedge roots go out 20-30 feet into the field. I'm losing yield on every row inside that zone. You cut the trees, the roots die, the yield comes back. The J.D. dealer in Waverly, a man named Clifton Burge who had strong opinions about everything and sold equipment to fund those opinions, put it most directly. He said it at the March co-op meeting, standing at the front of the room with a whiteboard and a marker. And he said it the way a man says something he's been rehearsing. A tree line, Clifton said, is a management choice. You choose to have it. You choose to give up those acres. You choose to let those roots compete with your crop. If you keep the trees, that's your business. But don't pretend it's free. Every tree line on your farm is costing you money. He wrote a number on the whiteboard. Earl looked at the number. Then Earl finished his coffee, put on his cap, and drove home. He walked the north windbreak that evening, the way he did most evenings in March when the fields were too wet to work. The cedars were 33 years old by then, 25 to 30 feet tall, the lower branches dense and interlocking, the upper canopy catching what was left of the afternoon light. The ash trees were taller, 40 feet, their crowns not yet leafed but showing the first buds of the season. The ground under the trees was soft, 33 years of needle fall and leaf litter, broken down by the worms and fungi that worked the damp soil beneath the canopy. Earl crouched down and pressed his hand into the leaf duff. It compressed like a sponge. 6 inches of organic matter, not manufactured, not purchased, built by the trees, season by season, the way slow things get built. He stood up and looked north, out across the open ground that began at the county road and ran flat for 3 miles to the next tree line, another farm's property. On a windy day in April, that open ground was a runway for the northwest wind. Earl had seen what that wind could do. He'd seen it in '74 when a sustained dry spell and a week of 25-mile-an-hour winds had taken the shine off his south fields, the ones without tree protection, and deposited a visible drift of pale silt along the east fence. His north fields, the ones behind the windbreak, had been untouched. Same wind, same soil, different result. Earl walked back to the house. He told his wife, Helen, what they'd said at the co-op meeting. Helen listened. Helen was a practical woman who kept the farm's books and had opinions she shared carefully, and only when she was sure of them. What would you do with 3 acres, she asked. Plant corn. And if the wind comes? Then we plant corn in the wind. Helen didn't say anything else. But that night after dinner she sat at the kitchen table with a notepad and a pencil and did a calculation that Earl didn't see until years later. She wrote down what the windbreak provided. Firewood, about 4 cords a year from the deadfall and the branches that came down in storms. At $120 a cord, that was $480. The deer and pheasant that used the tree line for cover, which meant Earl's hunting lease to 3 men from Kansas City, $600 a year. The reduced soil moisture loss on the north fields, which she estimated conservatively based on what she'd read in a Missouri Extension bulletin about evapotranspiration and wind speed, worth perhaps $15 per acre on 40 acres in a dry year. $600. The total came to $1,680 a year. The 3 acres of recovered cropland would produce $1,800, a difference of $120 a year. For $120 a year, Helen wrote at the bottom of the page, "We would give up the only thing standing between our north fields and the northwest wind." She folded the paper and put it in the kitchen drawer, under the rubber bands and the scratch pads, where it stayed until 2001. The clearing continued through 87 and into 88. Kenny Watts took out 6 miles of hedgerows. Pete Halloran cleared his east fence line, the one that had bordered a creek bottom for 40 years, the roots going down into the gravel and clay where the water moved in wet years. Dale Freak finished what he'd started and added a mile more on his south boundary. By the fall of '88, the county extension office estimated that Hardin County had lost more than 1,200 acres of tree lines, windbreaks, and shelter belts in 18 months. The landscape changed in a way you could see from the highway, where there had been dark bands of green breaking up the fields, marking boundaries, holding the creek banks, sheltering the cattle lots. There was now open ground, uniform and flat, running from road to road without interruption. The co-op called it progress. Earl kept his trees. The jokes started in the spring of '88, not mean jokes, farm country jokes, the kind that get told at the parts counter and the feed store and the coffee table at the diner, the kind that have just enough affection in them to make the cruelty comfortable. Earl Boden still got his tree line. "That was the first one," said by Dale Freak at the elevator in April, while they were waiting for the spring soil test results. "He does. 3 acres he's not farming, plus all that root competition." This from Kenny Watts. "Plus the shade. Man can't plant to the fence in that northwest corner because of the shade." Clifton Burge heard the conversation from behind the service desk and added what he always added. "A management choice," he said. "Earl's choosing to farm around those trees, his business, but it's a choice with a cost." The cost, by Clifton's calculation, $1,800 a year in recovered acres, plus $600 in reduced yield from root competition and shade, plus whatever the deer from the tree line cost in browse damage on the north fields. Call it $2,500 a year that Earl was paying to keep trees his grandfather planted. In 10 years, Clifton said, that's $25,000. Nobody argued with Clifton's math. The math was correct. What the math didn't include was the wind. The first sign came in the spring of 1989, a dry March. Winds from the northwest, 20 to 30 miles an hour for 4 days straight. The kind of sustained blow that picks up the fine particles from the soil surface and carries them. You could see it from the road. A faint brown haze over the open fields, the pale dust moving with the wind, collecting in the low spots, the fence rows, the ditch banks. Dale Freak's south field, the one where he'd cleared the last mile of tree line in '88, lost something that spring. Not dramatically, not a dust bowl. But the soil surface was lighter by June than it had been in October, the dark organic layer thin where the wind had worked it. Dale noticed it. He didn't say anything about it. Kenny Watts's fields showed the same thing. The open ground that had been hedgerows 18 months before, the soil there still disturbed from the clearing, was blowing. Pale streaks forming on the downwind side of field obstacles, the kind of movement that in a single spring amounts to maybe a half-ton of topsoil per acre. Acceptable by the standards of the Soil Conservation Service, invisible on a single inspection, but not invisible over 14 years. Earl's north fields didn't blow. The windbreak was working the way it had always worked, absorbing the northwest wind before it reached the crop. The air that came through the cedar and ash was slower, broken, unable to sustain the energy needed to lift the Grundy silt loam from the surface. Earl's north fields started every spring with their topsoil where it had been the previous fall. By 1991, the pattern was becoming visible in the soil color of Dale Freak's fields. On aerial photographs taken that year for a county land use study, you could see the difference. Dale's north fields, the ones that had lost their tree line protection, were paler than his south fields, which sat in a depression that gave them some natural wind protection. Dale saw the aerial photos at the extension office in Waverly. He didn't say anything. He went home and planted soybeans. "Now let me tell you about the well," Because the trees were doing something underground that nobody in Hardin County was thinking about in 1987. Roy Boden's windbreak, the 33-year-old cedars and ash on Earl's north boundary, was transpiring water, pulling it from the soil profile, cycling it through the tree tissue, releasing it as vapor into the air above the canopy. This is what trees do. They are biological pumps, moving water from the soil to the atmosphere, and in doing so, they cycle moisture through the landscape the way a heart cycles blood through a body. In winter, the trees caught snow. The dense cedar canopy and the interlocking lower branches created a physical barrier that slowed the north wind and caused the snow it carried to settle on the south side of the windbreak, the field side. The snowdrifts along the south edge of Earl's windbreak were deeper than the drifts in the open fields by a factor of 2 or 3. In spring, those drifts melted slowly, the cedar canopy providing enough shade to slow the melt and allow the water to infiltrate the soil gradually instead of running off in a fast thaw. Earl's north fields entered every growing season with more stored soil moisture than his open fields and far more than his neighbors' fields, which had no windbreak to catch snow. By the mid-1990s, the shallow wells on the cleared farms were changing. Kenny Watts's stock well, a 28-foot well that had served his cattle lot for 30 years, dropped 18 inches between 1993 and 1996. Pete Halloran's irrigation well, dug in 1979, showed a measurable drop in the water table that the well driller attributed to the dry summers of 93 and 95. Dale Frecke's shallow well, the one that fed the house, went from 22 feet of water column in 1987 to 17 feet in 1997. Earl's wells didn't drop. Nobody connected the wells to the tree lines. Not then. The drought years were the easy explanation, and the drought years were real. But the trees that had been cycling moisture through their root systems and releasing it back to the local atmosphere, moderating the local water budget the way a sponge moderates the flow of water through soil. Those trees were gone from 3/4 of the farms in the county, and the absence was cumulative. You don't notice the absence of a sponge until the water stops moving the way it used to. The summer of 2001 was dry, not a historic drought, not a disaster that made the national news. A sustained dry spell from late May through August that reduced rainfall by 35% from the average and exposed every weakness in every farming system in Hardin County. By the third week of July, the corn was showing stress. Leaf rolling in the afternoons, the natural response to heat and moisture deficit that tells a farmer his crop is pulling harder on a reserve that may not be there. The MU Extension office in Waverly was getting calls. Dale Frecke's corn rolled in the mornings on his north fields. Not the afternoons, the mornings, which meant the plants were exhausted overnight and starting each day already stressed. The topsoil on those fields was thinner than it had been in 1987. 14 years of spring wind had moved a measurable layer of the dark organic material that held water and nutrients. The pale, grundy subsoil was closer to the surface than it had been when Dale cleared his tree lines. A thinner topsoil holds less water. A field that holds less water runs out faster in a dry year. Let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching this video from. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and stay with us, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next video. Dale's North corn came in at 94 bushels per acre in 2001. Not a crop failure, not a disaster, but 94 bushels when the county average was 112. And when the fields on the south side of Dale's property, the fields with some natural protection from a drainage depression, were coming in at 118. The gap was 24 bushels per acre. On 80 acres of north field, that was 1,920 bushels. At $2.10 per bushel, that was $4,032 in a single season. Dale didn't publish those numbers. Farmers don't publish their yield maps at the co-op. But the combines tell the story the way combines always tell the story, by how long they run and how full the wagons come in. Dale's North Field combines ran short that August. Earl Boden's North Fields came in at 127 bushels per acre. Same county, same summer, same soil type. Same hybrid selection, near enough. Different tree lines. The windbreak had caught the winter snow and put it in the soil. The windbreak had slowed the spring wind and kept the topsoil where it was. The windbreak had moderated the summer heat along the north boundary, where the cedar canopy created a microclimate 3 to 5 degrees cooler than the open field on the hottest afternoons. And the corn in that moderated zone had used its moisture more efficiently, stretched further into the dry weeks of July, and come out the other side with a yield that reflected 14 years of accumulating advantages that nobody at the co-op had ever put on a whiteboard. Earl Boden's trees were worth, in the summer of 2001, at least $4,000 more than the 3 acres he hadn't cleared in a single year. Now let me tell you about what happened in September of 2001, because the drought had a second act that nobody in Hardin County was expecting. The creek that ran through the eastern part of the county, Crooked Creek, a small stream that drained several thousand acres of farmland into the Grand River, ran low that summer. Lower than anyone could remember. The cattle farmers who used the creek as a water source for their stock were hauling water by August. The gravel bars that were normally submerged were exposed and hot in the afternoon sun. The county soil conservation office sent a technician named Marcus Webb out to assess the erosion situation along Crooked Creek. What Marcus found on the eastern tributaries, the small drainages that ran off the cleared farmland into the creek, was the kind of thing that doesn't make headlines but tells the whole story to anyone who knows how to read it. The banks of the cleared drainages were eroded, not catastrophically, but measurably. The root systems of the tree lines that had held those banks since the 1940s were dead, killed when the trees were removed in '87 and '88, rotted out over the following decade, leaving the bank soil unsupported. Every high-water event since the clearing had cut a little deeper into the bank, undermined a little more of the channel edge, moved a little more of the creek bottom soil into the downstream sediment load. Marcus walked 3 miles of tributary drainage that September. He estimated the bank loss at an average of 8 inches per year on the cleared sections. 8 inches of creek bank per year, over 14 years, was more than 9 feet of agricultural land, and the subsoil underneath it, gone into the creek. On the section of Crooked Creek that ran along the boundary of Earl Boden's property, the banks were intact. The ash trees that grew along Earl's Creek edge, self-seeded, not planted, just volunteer trees that Earl had never cleared because Roy had told him to leave them, had root systems that went down 6, 8, 10 feet into the bank material. Those roots held the bank the way rebar holds concrete. The creek cut against them every high-water year and found nothing to take. Marcus Webb wrote his report. The report went to the Conservation Office files. Dale Fricka never read it. But the creek bank on Dale's east boundary told the story in the only language that farm country really believes. The language of what you can see with your own eyes on your own ground. In October of 2001, Dale Fricka drove to the north boundary of his property and parked his truck at the gate. He sat there for a while, long enough that his wife called his cell phone to ask if he was coming in for dinner. He was looking at Earl Boden's windbreak. The cedars were 48 years old by then. The ash trees were tall and full, the fall color yellow against the gray October sky. The windbreak was 30 feet wide and 3/4 of a mile long, a solid wall of green and gold that stood at the north edge of Earl's fields the way a levee stands at the edge of a floodplain. On Dale's side of the fence, open ground to the county road. Half a mile of unbroken field, sloping gently north, exposed to whatever came from that direction. On Earl's side of the fence, the windbreak, and behind it, north fields that had produced 107 bushels in the driest summer in a decade. Dale sat in his truck for a long time. Then he got out, climbed the gate, and walked across Earl's field to where Earl was checking his tile line outlets along the north fence. Earl saw him coming and waited. They hadn't talked much in 14 years, not unfriendly, just the distance that grows between two men who've made different choices and have been watching each other make those choices and keeping their own counsel about what they see. Earl? Dale? Dale looked at the windbreak. Up close, the cedars were massive, their lower branches touching the ground, the interior of the stand dark and dense and smelling of the particular dry sweetness of cedar resin. The ash trees stood at intervals through the cedar, their bark furrowed and gray, their roots disappearing into the soil at the base of the tree where the leaf litter had built up over decades. "You came in at 107 this year," Dale said. It wasn't a question. "Yep, I came in at 94. North Fields." Earl nodded. He didn't say anything. "The soil up there," Dale said. "It's not what it was." "I expect not. I've been watching it go lighter since 91. I thought it was the dry years. But the dry years hit you too." "They did. And your soil's still dark." Earl looked at his north field. The combine had finished it 2 weeks ago. The residue lay flat across the surface, the dark soil visible between the rows. Not pale, not thin. The same Grundy silt loam that Roy Boden had farmed in 1955, still present, still deep, still dark with the organic matter that 48 years of windbreak protection had kept in place. "My father planted those cedars in 1954, Earl said. "He said the wind was taking his topsoil. He said the only way to stop the wind was to put something in front of it." "I know. Your dad told mine the same thing in the 60s. My dad didn't listen. Neither did you." Dale was quiet. "No," he said. "I listened to Clifton Burge instead." Earl looked at him, not unkindly. "Clifton counted what the trees weren't producing," Earl said. "He never asked what they were doing. If you only count what something isn't, you'll always find a reason to get rid of it. That's not math. That's just missing half the numbers." Dale stood at the windbreak for a while longer. Then he shook Earl's hand and walked back across the field to his truck. He didn't say anything else. But the following March, Dale Fricka called the Missouri Department of Conservation and asked about the tree planting cost-share program. He planted 1,800 linear feet of native windbreak on his north boundary that spring. Eastern red cedar, green ash, wild plum, the same species Earl's father had put in the ground in 1954. The new trees would take 15 years to reach the height of Earl's windbreak. Dale was 51 years old when he planted them. He would be 66 before they did their full work. He planted them anyway. Clifton Burge retired from the J.D. dealership in Waverly in 2003. He'd sold the business to a dealer group from Des Moines and taken a farm he owned outright on the east side of the county, 160 acres that he'd been renting out for years and now intended to manage himself. Clifton had strong opinions about farming. He'd expressed those opinions from behind a service counter for 25 years. Now he was going to farm. In the spring of 2004, Clifton walked his east field for the first time as an operator instead of an observer. The field had been in cash rent for 11 years. The previous tenant had cleared the fence row trees in 1995, the same clearing fever that had hit the county in the late 80s, arriving late to this property. The clearing had recovered 2 acres. The tenant had planted those 2 acres to corn and added them to his yield maps and felt good about the decision. What the yield maps didn't show was what Clifton found when he walked the east field in April of 2004. The soil on the east boundary, the section that had lost its tree line 9 years earlier, was visibly lighter than the soil 200 feet into the field. Not dramatically lighter. You had to know what you were looking at. But Clifton had sold equipment in this county for 25 years. He'd seen enough fields to know what Grundy silt loam looked like at full organic content and what it looked like when the organic layer had been thinning for a decade. The east boundary soil was thinning. He walked the field and felt the difference under his boots. The middle of the field was spongy in April. The east boundary soil was firmer, denser, less able to absorb the weight of a foot. The organic matter that made soil soft and water-retentive was depleted there. The wind that came from the east, not the dominant northwest wind but the spring southeast wind that came up the river valley in March and April, had been working that boundary for 9 years without the trees to slow it. Clifton stood at the east fence line and looked at what wasn't there. 2 acres of corn, he'd told every farmer in the county for 15 years. That's what you get when you clear your tree lines. 2 acres of corn. What he was looking at was the other side of that calculation. The topsoil that left that field in 9 years of unprotected exposure was not 2 acres of corn. It was not a number that fit on a whiteboard. It was the accumulated biology and organic matter and mineral structure of a soil that had been building since the last glacier. It was 30 years of yield potential per inch, and the inches were getting thinner. Clifton went back to the house and made a phone call. He called Earl Boden. "Earl, this is Clifton Burge. I want to talk to you about your windbreak." A pause. "All right," Earl said. "I told the whole county to take their tree lines out. I had a number on the whiteboard. The number was right, but I was only counting one side." Another pause. "You were," Earl said. "What was on the other side?" And Earl told him. The snow catch, the wind protection, the moisture retention, the creek bank stability, the biological diversity that kept his pest pressure lower than his neighbors, the deer lease, the firewood, the 127 bushels per acre in the worst summer in a decade. He told Clifton all of it, not gloating. Not like a man who'd been waiting 14 years to say "I told you so." Like a man explaining to his neighbor why the fence still matters. Clifton listened. When Earl finished, Clifton said one thing. "I had half the math. You did. And I told it to everyone in the county like it was the whole thing." "You did." "I'm going to plant trees on my east fence line." "Good," Earl said. "The Conservation Department has a cost-share program. Call Marcus Webb in Waverly. He'll get you set up." Clifton planted trees on his east fence line in the spring of 2005. Eastern red cedar, hackberry, and native plum. Marcus Webb helped him design the planting. Clifton paid half the cost. The Conservation Department paid the other half. The trees went in the ground at 3 to 4 feet tall. By 2015, they were 18 feet, beginning to do the work that Earl's trees had been doing since before Clifton sold his first tractor. In 2002, the University of Missouri Extension Service commissioned a county-level soil erosion study in Hardin County. The study was prompted by Marcus Webb's 2001 report on Crooked Creek bank erosion and by a series of conversations between the County Conservation District and the State Extension Office about the tree-clearing trend of the late 1980s. The study compared soil organic matter levels, topsoil depth, and corn yield data on farms that had cleared tree lines between 1987 and 1990 against farms that had maintained their tree cover during the same period. Let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching this video from. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and stay with us, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next video. The results were published in 2004 in a Missouri Extension Bulletin titled Windbreak Removal and Agricultural Soil Productivity, a 15-year assessment. The key finding was this: on farms that had cleared tree lines between 1987 and 1990, topsoil organic matter content had declined an average of 0.4 percentage points over 15 years on fields within 300 feet of the removed tree line. On farms that had maintained tree cover, no measurable decline was detected on protected fields. A 0.4 percentage point decline in organic matter on Grundy silt loam corresponded to a yield drag of 8 to 12 bushels per acre per year on corn in a dry year. On a 40-acre field, that was 320 to 480 bushels per year. At $2.50 per bushel, that was $800 to $1,200 per year in permanent yield reduction from erosion that had been accumulating since the chainsaws came in 1987. The 3 acres recovered by clearing the tree line had produced, at $600 per acre gross margin, $1,800 per year. The yield drag on the protected strip of field adjacent to the removed tree line had cost, over 15 years, between $12,000 and $18,000 in cumulative lost yield. The math was not, as Clifton Burge had put it on the whiteboard in 1987, $1,800 per year gained. The math was $1,800 per year gained against $800 to $1,200 per year permanently lost, diminishing with every year that the topsoil continued to thin. The County Extension Bulletin was distributed to every farm in Hardin County. Brenda Holt, the extension agent who had shown Dale Fricke the efficiency numbers in 1987, read the bulletin in her office in Waverly. She'd left the county extension job in 1995 and gone to work for the state office in Columbia. She read the bulletin and thought about the conversation she'd had with Dale in the spring of '87. She wrote a note in the margin of the bulletin's conclusion section. The note said, "We counted only what the trees weren't producing. We should have counted what they were." Earl Boden retired from active farming in 2009. He was 80 years old. His son Gary had been taking over pieces of the operation since 2001. And by 2009 Gary was running the whole thing, the 360 acres and the windbreak and the creek bottom ash trees and the 48 Hereford cows that had grazed the same pasture since Roy Boden bought them in 1965. Earl's wife Helen died in 2006. At the memorial service, Gary told the story of the notepad in the kitchen drawer, the calculation Helen had done in 1987, when the co-op was full of enthusiasm for tree clearing and Clifton Burge was writing numbers on whiteboards. He read her numbers aloud. The firewood, the hunting lease, the soil moisture retention value. And he read her final line. "For $120 a year," he read, "we would give up the only thing standing between our north fields and the northwest wind." The room was quiet. She wrote that in 1987, Gary said. She kept it in the kitchen drawer for 19 years. She never said it out loud, because Dad had already made the decision and she didn't need to convince him. She just needed to know she was right. She was right. In 2012, the Missouri Department of Conservation designated Earl's Windbreak as a legacy shelter belt, one of fewer than 30 original plantings from the 1950s conservation era still standing and intact in the state. The cedars Roy Boden had planted in 1954 were 58 years old. Some of the original trees had died and been replaced by natural succession, young ash and hackberry filling the gaps, but the structure of the windbreak was intact, the 30-foot wide wall of canopy still standing between the northwest wind and the north fields. The designation came with a small sign and a mention in the Conservation Department's annual report. It came with no money. It didn't need money. The windbreak had been paying for itself since 1954. Earl Boden died in 2014 at 85 years old. He farmed until he was 78. He never cleared his tree lines. He never felt the need to explain why. He watched. He saw what the trees were doing. He stayed with what worked. The day after Earl's funeral, Gary walked the north windbreak, the way Earl had walked it, the way Roy Boden had walked it before Earl. The cedars were 60 years old, massive now, their lower branches dense against the ground, the interior of the stand dark and cool in the October afternoon. The ash trees stood through the cedar at intervals, their bark deeply furrowed, their root systems running 20 feet into the soil below. The leaf litter under the trees was 8 inches deep, 60 years of needle fall and leaf fall, slow composting in the damp shade, building the soft organic layer that made the soil beneath the windbreak the richest soil on the property. Gary crouched down and pressed his hand into the leaf duff, the way Earl used to, the way Roy used to before that. It compressed like a sponge. He stood up and looked north. Dale Fricke's windbreak, planted in 2002, now 12 years old, was visible across the county road, 12 feet tall. Young trees still, but growing. Growing the way all slow things grow. 1 year at a time, 1 windstorm at a time, 1 spring thaw, 1 snowdrift, 1 season of leaf fall at a time, becoming something that, in another 40 years, a grandson would put his hand into and feel compressed like a sponge, and know that it was built by patience. In the spring of 2024, Gary Boden's daughter, Lily, came back to the farm. She'd studied environmental science at Mizzou and worked for a conservation nonprofit in St. Louis for 7 years. She came home because the farm needed a 3rd generation, and because she'd spent 7 years talking about soil health and found herself wanting to farm it instead. On her first full week back, she walked the north windbreak. Gary told her the story, Roy planting the trees in 1954, the co-op pressure in 1987, Earl's quiet refusal, Helen's notepad in the kitchen drawer, the 127 bushels in the drought of 2001, Dale Fricka at the fence line in October. Lily stood in the windbreak and listened. Then she asked Gary a question. What does the windbreak cost us every year, in real terms? Gary thought about it. Maybe $400 in foregone cropland value, the 3 acres. Maybe $200 in edge management, keeping the fence clear. $600 a year. About that, and what does it provide? Gary smiled. He told her what Roy told Earl, what Earl told Gary, what the land had been showing the Boden family for 70 years. Lily listened. Then she took out her phone and calculated. At $600 a year operating cost, she said, the windbreak has cost the family about $22,000 since Grandpa planted it in 1954. She paused. The yield protection alone, in 2001, was worth $4,000 in 1 year. The hunting lease has generated over $40,000 since the 1970s. The soil organic matter that didn't blow away, at current carbon credit prices, that's worth more per acre than the corn. Gary looked at her. And the trees are still standing, she said, still growing, still catching snow, still slowing the wind, still doing everything Great-Grandpa Roy needed them to do when he planted them in 1954. She put her phone in her pocket and walked further into the windbreak. The co-op counted what the trees weren't producing, she said, 3 acres of corn. She stopped beside one of the original cedars. Roy Boden's cedar, 70 years old, a trunk 18 inches in diameter, bark deeply ridged, the lower branches touching the ground. They never counted this, she said. She put her hand on the bark. They never asked what it was doing. Sometimes the most productive thing on a farm is the thing that doesn't produce a crop. Sometimes the man who refuses to cut is the man who understands what cutting costs. And sometimes a double row of cedar and ash, planted by a quiet man in the spring of 1954, on a gentle slope in the north part of a county that nobody outside that county has ever heard of, turns out to be the most valuable thing on the property. Not because it's scenery, because it's working. It was always working. The co-op laughed for 14 years. The trees stood for 70. The trees won. End of script. Total word count of 4 thesaler for Herodath. So loved as Warden and Pythianan 72 minutes at 150 WPM.